A young black woman in oil-stained overalls stepped out from the shadows near the scaffolding, her expression unreadable, her dark eyes calm and steady. As she approached the prototype with gait too confident for someone listed in the employee records as a junior mechanic. Her name tag read J. Carter, but no one paid it much attention until the CEO himself, Preston Maddox, all bone-white arrogance in corporate silk, turned with a voice soaked in mockery and power and said, "Well, since our best minds can't fix it, why don't we give the grease monkey a shot?" Janelle Carter slid on her gloves, stepped toward the dyeing machine with the reverence of a surgeon approaching a heartbeat, her mind already tracing lines and failures the others had overlooked, not because she was smarter, though she was, but because she had built this engine before in 100 variations, in her father's notebooks and simulations, long before ether dynamics claimed it as their breakthrough. 18 years earlier, her father, Dr. Elijah Carter, had been the lead propulsion theorist at Ether until a crash took his life under classified conditions. And the day she saw his funeral was the day she began tearing apart engines to find what killed him, not just the machine but the men behind it. Now, standing in the belly of the beast that stole his legacy, she opened the Skyhawk's core with hands that didn't tremble, bypassing the flashy interface and tracing her fingers along the intake housing, whispering quietly, "He told you this would fail," as if speaking to ghosts, then rerouted a redundant pressure valve and reinitialized a subroutine buried so deep in the OS that no one at the company even knew it was there, except, apparently, the man who designed it and the daughter who had spent her life decoding his brilliance in secret. The entire room had gone still, investors leaning forward, engineers exchanging nervous glances, and Preston Maddox crossing his arms with that smug grin he always wore when betting on failure. But when the engine began to pulse, slow and rhythmic like a heartbeat restarting, and the turbines began to glow with stabilized burn instead of volatile flare, the silence turned into a collective gasp, and Maddox's smile evaporated into a pale grimace as the system fully rebooted and the Skyhawk X powered to full idle, smooth, controlled, alive. No one clapped, not yet. They just stared, stunned, as Janelle removed her gloves, tossed them on the floor, and looked directly at Preston for the first time, her voice low but unwavering. "You said you'd resign if I fixed it. I'd like that in writing." And the man who had laughed at her minutes earlier found himself on the edge of collapse, because what he hadn't realized when he threw that dare was that this wasn't just a mechanic with intuition. This was the daughter of the man whose stolen blueprints had launched his company into aerospace dominance, the girl who'd grown up piecing together her father's death one bolt at a time. And now she was standing in the center of his empire, not just to fix his mistake, but to bury the lie that built his legacy. Murmurs rippled to the hangar, not from the investors. They were silent, but from the engineers, the technicians, the interns in the back who had known something wasn't right for years, but had never dared speak up. And now they were watching a woman in stained denim do what none of them had ever managed, prove that the truth could walk into the lion's den and make the lions listen. And as the Skyhawk X whirred gently behind her, Janelle Carter didn't ask for applause. She walked past the CEO and toward the exit, pulling a small black notebook from her pocket, the same notebook that had belonged to her father, filled with equations and sketches that matched Ether's proprietary engine design almost line for line. And she thought, not for the first time, that the only thing more dangerous than a company built on stolen genius was a woman brave enough to return and take it back piece by piece, until the lie crumbled and the world remembered the name they tried to erase, not Maddox, Carter. The moment Janelle Carter stepped back from the humming Skyhawk X engine, the hangar fell into a silence so thick it rang louder than the chaos before. Engineers froze in mid-sentence, investors mid-scoff, and CEO Preston Maddox mid-smirk, all suddenly watching the woman they'd mock stand beside a machine no one else had managed to revive, the prototype that sputtered, choked, and failed in front of billion-dollar stakeholders was now alive, balanced, and stable. It's once jammed. Induction system spinning smooth under the soft overhead lights, casting reflections off Janelle's oil-stained shirt like medals earned in a war no one else had seen her fight. And for a full 15 seconds, Preston didn't blink, couldn't blink, because what stood before him wasn't the spectacle he'd orchestrated to humiliate a diversity hire. It was a resurrection of something he thought safely buried under patents and silence history. And when the lead investor, Franklin Choi, a pragmatic tech titan with a mind for numbers and an eye for fraud, walked toward the humming jet engine with an expression somewhere between suspicion and awe. Preston's jaw tightened, because he already knew the question that was coming. "Who designed that bypass?" Choi asked, staring at the modified heat vent that Janelle had welded together with pieces of old aluminum tubing, and she replied calmly and precisely, "My father, Dr. Elijah Carter." The silence cracked, like glass struck by a bullet, the name sending ripples of crowd like a ghost had been summoned, and Preston's internal alarm screamed, because that name, that buried genius, that blacklisted man who was supposed to stay erased, had just been spoken aloud in his own damn hangar. But Janelle wasn't finished. She calmly pulled a small flash drive from her back pocket, wiped it clean on her sleeve, and held it up like a scalpel in a surgeon's hand, saying, "Everything in this engine, down to the torque balance rotor blade angles, is stolen. Traced from my father's personal archives, notes he left behind before his accidental crash." And the room shifted, the crowd no longer seeing a grease-stained mechanic, but something sharper, something dangerous, a woman who knew too much and had proof to burn the place down. Preston, hands still crossed in maintained power posture, took a step forward with a laugh too forced to sound natural. "Look, we gave her a shot. She got lucky, but let's not get into conspiracy theories." But his voice cracked on conspiracy, and the board members noticed, the engineers noticed, the interns in the corner noticed, and worst of all, Choi noticed, his eyes narrowing as he stepped beside Janelle and asked, "May I see that drive?" To which he replied, "Only if you promise not to let them destroy it like they did my father." And in that moment, something in Preston's grip slipped, not just control, but reputation, leverage. Everything he protected by climbing over corpses and secrets, because the woman in front of him wasn't just fixing engines. She was realigning the very gears of justice he'd long kept rusted and jammed. As the drive was plugged into a secure terminal, and archive schematics bearing Elijah Carter's signature flashed on screen, identical to the so-called Maddox rotor design, patented 2 years after crash. A slow wave of gasps and side glances rippled through the crowd, and Janelle, steady as iron, said clearly, "This company was built on stolen work, and I'm not leaving until my father's name is on every blueprint." And with each syllable, Preston felt the empire he'd so carefully sculpted with polished lies begin to crumble. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, sharp voice of a daughter who come not for vengeance, but for truth. The board called an emergency meeting. The head of legal started sweating bullets, and as security tried subtly approaching Janelle, Choi held up a single hand and barked, "Touch her, and I'll pull every cent of my investment," freezing the mid-step. And as Janelle turned one last time to the engine, her father's engine, and ran her hand across the warm casing, she whispered, "I told you I'd finish what you started, Dad," not knowing that the next 24 hours would bring subpoenas, press leaks, old colleagues stepping out of shadows, and a storm of justice that no amount of money, NDA, or corporate spin could stop, because the Carter legacy was no longer buried. It had taken flight, BY morning. Ether Dynamics was no longer a fortress of untouchable brilliance, but a company under siege, its name trending across news outlets, its stock dipping by 11% before noon, and the inboxes of every executive overflowed with demands for answers from regulator journalists and one silent engineers emboldened by what Janelle Carter had ignited. The flash drive had done its job, and so had Janelle, but she wasn't finished, not by a long shot, because beneath the stolen designs and buried, patents was something uglier, something her father had once hinted at in the final pages of his notebook, pages marked with cryptic margins and incomplete code fragments he never explained, but which now, when overlaid with the Skyhawk's current system map, revealed anomalies, security overrides, ghost protocols, fail-safe disruptions embedded into the engine's control logic that no engineer had dared question, either because they didn't understand it or because they'd been told not to ask. And so Janelle, who now had unrestricted access thanks to investor protection and a growing media presence that made her removal politically unwise, moved like a shadow through the digital archives of Ether's secure intranet, entering late at night with a badge borrowed from a sympathetic systems engineer named Ellis, who'd worked under her father years ago and whispered over coffee, "There's more than you know." They erased entire sections of his R&D logs before sliding a decryption key across the table and walking away like a man unburdened for the first time in years. With Ellis's key and her own raw brilliance, Janelle pieced together the puzzle. The Skyhawk wasn't just a prototype. It was a cover, a baited trap designed to work just long enough to attract military contracts before imploding under engineered stress failures, allowing Maddox to blame technical limitations, while quietly shifting billions into a separate shell company that manufactured the real, weaponized versions of her father's design, stripped of safety protocols, stripped of ethics, built not for exploration or energy efficiency, but for high-altitude weapon deployment. Airborne dominance masked as innovation, and it was her father who had tried to stop it 18 years ago, her father who had refused to let his work become a tool of war, and her father who paid the price when the small charter plane he boarded for a conference in Zurich went down under instrument failure with no survivors and no investigation. Until now. Janelle sat in the same hangar where she'd first resurrected the Skyhawk, laptop open beside the humming aircraft, staring at the final piece of evidence, a falsified maintenance report signed by a technician who disappeared 6 months after Elijah's death, a report that falsified engine diagnostics to make the crash look mechanical instead of triggered, and she knew in her bones, in the marrow of her memory, that her father hadn't just died, he'd been eliminated, and so she stood, shoulders squared, and walked to the executive wing during peak daylight, past employees who paused in corridors to nod or offer hushed encouragement, past interns who now saw her not as a mechanic, but as a force, past engineers who silently passed or copied notes from old servers and backdoor logs, until she entered the executive boardroom where Preston Maddox sat with 3 attorneys, a compliance officer, and 2 visibly panicked PR consultants who looked at her as though the storm had just walked in on legs. Miss Carter, Maddox said to a forced smile, tried to reassert control. This isn't your department. But she dropped the report on the table and said, "This is your cover-up," then handed a second flash drive to the board chairman, who inserted it into the conference terminal and watched as a cascade of timestamps, IP logins, bank transfers, and blacked-out emails from over a decade ago filled the massive monitor behind them, all connecting ether. Dynamics to illegal defense contracts, misappropriated DARPA funds, and the forced erasure of whistleblowers who tried to speak before, but lacked the name, the proof, and the voice Janelle now wielded with surgical precision. The chairman turned slowly toward Maddox, face drained of color, and muttered, "You told us Carter died in an unrelated incident," to which Preston, stammering, replied, "It was compartmentalized. I wasn't the only one who knew, but no one was listening anymore because the truth had taken a room by force, and even the lawyers began shifting away from Maddox like rats abandoning a leaking yacht." Janelle leaned forward, hands planted firmly on the table, and said, "I'm giving you 48 hours to resign, relinquish all proprietary claims to my father's work, and publicly clear his name, or I go to the DOJ, the press, and every family who lost someone flying your defective prototypes." And with those words, she didn't just challenge Preston Maddox. She dismantled him. Because no amount of stock options or scripted press releases could survive the fire she now held in her hands. And as she turned to leave, the room still frozen behind her, someone in the hallway began to clap. Just one person, then 2, then a ripple of applause followed her like a procession, echoing down the halls of company that had once been machined for silencing people like her, now witnessing its own reckoning delivered by the woman it had tried to keep invisible. Within 24 hours of the confrontation in the boardroom, the world knew the name Dr. Elijah Carter again, but this time not as a footnote in an old patent or the tragic victim of a mysterious crash, but as the true mind behind one of the most advanced aerospace propulsion systems of the century, a genius whose life's work had been buried, appropriated, and profited from by the very company now collapsing under the weight of its own deception, and at the center of it all stood Janelle, no longer the unknown mechanic in overalls, but the daughter who had broken the silence, a technical whistleblower in the face of corporate reckoning in every news cycle from CNN to engineering journals that once refused to print her father's theories. Her leaked drive, authenticated by 3 independent security labs, had gone viral within hours, exposing not only the systemic theft of her father's work, but the illegal defense funneling Preston Maddox had orchestrated through offshore contracts, black budget filings, and falsified R&D divisions meant to disguise military tech under civilian innovation. And while Preston issued a heavily lawyered video statement denying personal knowledge of any impropriety, the truth had already struck its chord. The media, the engineers, the public weren't interested in his backpedaling anymore. They were watching Janelle, who stood on the steps of the very hangar where it all began, in the same coveralls she'd worn on her first day, holding the original schematic notebook in one hand and her father's framed engineering license in the other. Her voice, steady as she told the press, "This is not a revenge story. It's a return. My father never wanted power. He wanted progress. I'm here to finish what he started." That speech alone sparked congressional hearings, class action lawsuits from families who'd lost pilots to Ether's unstable engine variants, and an emergency meeting within the Defense Department about unauthorized tech leaks. But more than that, it sparked a cultural shift, especially within the tech and engineering world, where black and brown inventors began flooding social media with hashtag #NotYourGreaseMonkey, sharing stories of ideas dismissed, voices silenced, careers stalled under gatekeepers who wore polished shoes and patent badges they never earned. And while Preston's empire unraveled, his board ousting him in a panicked midnight vote, subpoenas delivered to his gated estate, and old allies turning state's witness to save themselves, Janelle worked quietly in the background, not celebrating, not gloating, but building, partnering with ethical investors and former Ether engineers to launch Carter Dynamics, a cooperative startup structured on transparency, co-ownership, and research-first mission development, where young engineers trained under the actual math that made the Skyhawk possible, and every meeting room bore a single quote in steel lettering. Ideas belong to the people who dream them, not the men who steal them. But not everyone celebrated her rise. Online forums lit up with targeted hate. Anonymous messages warned her to drop it. And once her apartment was broken into, her father's notebook missing for 12 tense hours until it turned up in a locked campus library return bin with a note. "You're getting too close to the original source." And Janelle knew then that the people who had silenced her father hadn't all retired. Some were still in labs and committees, in suits too afraid to lose a fortune, built on someone else's mind. And so she dug deeper, launching an independent investigation with journalists and forensic auditors, tracing the timeline of her father's last months and reconstructing the last 48 hours of his life, during which he had reportedly handed a sealed envelope to a colleague in Geneva marked version X. Do not implement without Carter Protocol. A file that mysteriously vanished from Ether's archive after his death, through legal battles, archived voicemail recoveries, and a single audio fragment left on a corrupted CD she found hidden in his workshop. His voice, faint but clear, saying, "If this gets out before the ethics layer is complete, people will die." Janelle realized the truth. The original engine wasn't just repulsion. It was self-replicating adaptive tech, a system that learned mid-flight and evolved under pressure, capable of becoming a weapon of ungoverned, and Ether had built it without the safety restrictions he'd begged them to wait for. She held the final schematic in her hand now, retrieved through encrypted backup she decrypted over months, and she stared at the last note he ever wrote in the margin. "Protect them from what I made possible." That night, Janelle stood alone in the hangar again, the Skyhawk X resting silent in the dark, its turbines cold, its history tainted. And she placed her hand on the carbon alloy casing and whispered, "I'm not just fixing engines anymore, Dad. I'm fixing the world they broke with it." And as the wind rushed into the open doors and rustled her hair, she knew that what came next wouldn't just change her life. It might save others from repeating the mistake that had cost her father everything. The press conference was held beneath a clear October sky, the morning sunlight bouncing off the curved chrome panels of the Skyhawk X prototype, now displayed not as a symbol of Ether Dynamics deception, but as a memorial of reclaimed truth, parked on the tarmac of the newly renamed Carter Aeronautics Research Pavilion, where thousands had gathered, engineers, students, media, military officials, and families whose lives had unknowingly been touched by Dr. Elijah Carter's buried brilliance. And when Janelle stepped up to the podium, flanked not by lawyers or handlers, but by former Ether engineers, whistleblowers, and a group of STEM students from her new mentorship program, the silence that followed was not emptiness. It was reverence, as if the very air recognized this moment had taken 18 years, one death, and a daughter's fury to arrive. She spoke without paper, her voice measured and clear. "My name is Janelle Carter, and I stand here not as a disruptor, but as a daughter reclaiming her father's name from the machine that tried to erase it." And she paused just long enough for the words to land like a gavel, then continued, Elijah Carter wasn't just an engineer. He was a teacher, a pacifist, a proponent of human-centered design and clean energy. When he pushed back, they silenced him as he warned his company that using his technology without safety protocols would put lives in danger. Today, we end that silence. And as the crowd erupted in applause, a line of reporters surged forward, but Janelle didn't linger. She stepped down, walked straight to the gleaming engine, and placed a framed photo of her father at its base, next to a bronze plaque now bolted onto the fuselage that read, "Designed by Dr. Elijah Carter, restored by his daughter." That moment, captured by dozens of cameras, would appear on magazine covers and textbooks for generations. But for Janelle, it wasn't the attention that mattered. It was the clarity, the completion of something sacred, the weight lifted from her chest and placed where it belonged. In the hands of truth. In the weeks that followed, federal prosecutors formally charged Preston Maddox with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and wrongful death negligence, and while his legal team clawed for plea, deals, and protective settlements, the Justice Department, backed by a wave of public pressure and signed affidavits from former colleagues, moved forward with full prosecution. Ether Dynamics was placed under federal receivership, renamed under an ethical oversight committee, and all patents tied to Elijah Carter were legally transferred to his estate, which Janelle used to launch the Carter Initiative, a nonprofit devoted to transparent tech development, equitable engineering mentorship, and funding safety-first aerospace research that couldn't be swallowed or repackaged by corporate greed. Journalists dubbed her the daughter who dismantled a lie. But to those who knew her, she was simply the woman who refused to let brilliance die unrecognized. And as she walked the halls of Carter Dynamics' new research wing months later, watching young women of color building drones, experimenting with propulsion models, referencing her father's once-forgotten formulas, now displayed proudly on their walls, she felt something rare, something pure, not vengeance, not triumph, but peace. She would visit her father's grave later that week for the first time in over a year, this time not just to mourn but to speak, to tell him that the notebook had been published in full, that his final designs were now taught in classrooms, that the world no longer whispered his name in footnotes, but shouted it with respect. And as she sat on the grass beside his headstone, sun warm on her skin, she whispered, "You were right. You have always been. And I promise, I'll never let them bury another voice like yours again." And in the distance, across the skyline, a small Carter-built glider soared through the air on student-controlled autopilot. Quiet, graceful, and free, exactly the way he'd intended. And with that, Janelle Carter stood up, brushed off her knees, and walked into a future she forged not with rage, but with resolve. Proving to the world that you can silence a man, you can steal his ideas, but you can't stop the truth when his daughter learns how to fly.